Hey guys and girls, welcome to this week's episode of the B.Invested Birchy podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Birch, and this is the show unraveling the truth of the 21st century. We're now exiting the matrix and waking up to motherfucking reality. That never gets old. The intro never gets old. So, yeah. Today, I have a returning guest, very special guest. Simon, thanks for coming back.
It's good to be back on.
Beautiful, beautiful. I remember last time we did a podcast and we did an event and everyone just loved the content that you had. And yeah, today we've got a lot of info to unpack and I'm really excited to have the chat with you. So, yeah.
Yes, there's always lots happening in demographics, very much obviously linked to anything that smells like property, is very, very linked to the demographic realities that we are facing in Australia.
Yeah, and since we last got up, I think it was probably about 2 years ago, or 18 months ago, I feel like demographics, like just where I live, have changed tremendously, right? Just in such a short period of time, and migration and the roads are busier and all that sort of stuff, which is great for me as a property investor. But, it's great to have, the insights and I guess the things that you see before it happens is what you specialize in. So, yeah. Simon, your business is the demographics group. I guess for some of the viewers that are just watching for the first time, maybe you can give us a bit of a background just on your journey and what you do and your business and
absolutely. So at the demographics group, we focus on one thing and one thing only, and that is understanding the world through the demographic lens, meaning how do those big population movements, meaning what type of cohort lives where and what types of jobs do they have, what kind of things do they value. So there's a lot of behavioral economics in there as well. How do those things change your world? And then we talk to people, and this could be a set of property investors. This could be a specific local government area where we say how these services that they provide might be shifting over time as new cohorts move in. Or this might be a dog food company. It might be a big retailer in the country. So we literally, it's a self-serving narrative, of course. Anything that you look at has a demographic angle to it. And we explain to people how their thing looks through the demographic lens.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess, we've got the election that's happening and we've got all these stats being thrown out there. There's mud from different sides and whatnot. What are you seeing at the moment, Simon, in the current property market and trends and things since we last caught up?
Yeah, so a couple of truisms about property in Australia are, if we have more and more people in the country year after year, these people need to be housed. That is as obvious as it gets as a statement. So that is a good baseline for property investment. If you are overall in a market that continues to grow. Within Australia, there are, of course, certain areas that grow more than others. There are areas that people want to live in more desperately than in others. But of course, even smaller property markets might be, from an investment perspective, marvelous places to throw your money at because there are not that many people playing there, meaning that even though this, and you know this much better than I, where these hot spots are, there are relatively small markets that see humble growth, but because no one is building, you just see values go up. You have very juicy yields in those small markets. These yields would go down if we were to massively increase supply in this small market, but because we are still operating in a market where we have nowhere near enough developers, nowhere near enough construction workers to build the stuff, that means the small markets get pretty much ignored. For all intents and purposes. So if you can buy into those markets, sometimes they are very, very attractive locations. But of course, we also have markets that continue to just decline. These are markets that fully rely on agriculture, for example, and farms aggregate, meaning, the old farmer sells, his kids don't take over the farm, and then the farm gets bought by the neighbor. They operate a bigger land with more high-tech machinery, and then they need fewer workers to get the same yields out, and then the town shrinks away bit by bit. So this wouldn't be a great investment. But in Australia, overall, we are pretty much seeing population growth everywhere we look.
Yeah. I've noticed that we're talking beforehand, and I always say I don't like flying, and I'm like driving everywhere. And I've seen in my travels, it doesn't matter where. In Sydney, last time I drove to far north Queensland, I drove to like right up the Cape York, and it was like I was on a busy Sydney road all the way through, right? Like there's just people traveling everywhere. I don't know if it's because they can work remotely nowadays, and changes that are happening out there. So it's interesting, just in the last few years of what's really.
Yeah, and this has to do with the geography of Australia.
Yeah.
So Australia, obviously being a very big country, and for the last 100+ years, we have not added more cities. Each state gets granted one big capital city, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and then up to a handful of satellite cities, in secondary cities in reasonable commuting distance. And then we have a couple of agricultural hubs. These are essentially small towns that are there to repair a tractor. And we have a couple of mining towns. That's it.
Yeah.
And we now continue to grow the population, and they all are being thrown on the same cities. So therefore the land values continue to go up. We continue to bit by bit densify our cities, and then we're adding more and more people on the same roads.
Yeah. And do you think that moving forward, what do you see happening with all the data that you're seeing? Like how many people in the country the last 2 years or so? Like 700,000, 600,000?
Yeah. So the last 2 years, I wouldn't get too excited about, because what happened over the last 2.5 years is that we saw the highest migration intake ever, and people criticized this quite strictly. They said, "Oh, this is madness. We have this housing shortage, and we're taking in more migrants than ever before. This is just the migration Ponzi scheme." I would say, just everyone calm down. What happened here is just a catch up of the COVID outflow of migrants. During the first couple of years of the pandemic, we lost large numbers of migrants to overseas. And so if you just take the net migration numbers from the beginning of COVID until now, and you compare this with the net migration intake of the same period of time before the pandemic, you see that absolutely nothing has changed. So the spike that occurred in the last 1.5 or 2 years was just us taking in 3.5 years worth of international students, which make up almost half of the migration intake, in 1.5 years. That's what that was. And so it's a cheap political talking point. We have an election coming up very, very soon that can be ignored for all intents and purposes. When people talk about cutting migration in Australia, they either have no idea what they're talking about, because you can't cut migration quickly to begin with, because we have signed heaps of international legislations and so forth, and treaties, who we take in, what not, and some temporary migrants don't need a visa per se. So either they don't know what they're talking about, or it's just a political scapegoat, a cheap political talking point, which I would argue more often is the point. And of course, one important thing to remember in Australia is that migrants are part of the business model. In Australia, 54, 52, it varies a bit, % of the tax income that the state, the government, federal government takes in is income tax. And if you cut migrant numbers, you minimize income tax. So the treasurer would never allow their PM to cut migration numbers. If you ever want to take a politician serious that is talking about migrant numbers, only do this if at the same time he or she talks about completely changing the way we tax the countries. We could do this theoretically. We could say we minimize income tax like crazy. You get to keep a much higher share of your income. But that means we need to tax your wealth. Stamp duty out, income tax or proper land tax in. We find some sort of way of taxing your wealth. All of these things could theoretically be done, but there's zero appetite for it in the country. So just ignore any politician who talks about cutting migration, because they will not do it.
I always look at it and I hear it and I'm like, there'll be political suicide. They need to keep the cash flow happening to the country to pay the debt.
And if you listen very carefully, Peter Dutton talks about things like cutting permanent migration. That means you just hand out fewer permanent visas, you take in more temporary visas. From a housing perspective, it makes no difference because you got to house a person regardless of their of what is printed on their visa form. If that makes sense. It is just cheap political scapegoat narratives that can be completely ignored.
Yeah. Interesting. And I guess, like from the data that you're seeing, like what sort of things are you seeing, Simon, that are, the migration that's happening and, property markets? Like, is there a shift that you're seeing, like baby boomers moving somewhere, or is there migrants moving to smaller towns or moving to capital cities, Melbourne or Perth or?
So there are three main stories, demographically speaking, in terms of housing movements. The probably biggest one is that the largest generation of them all, the Millennials, so people born in the 80s and 90s, they just at the beginning of the pandemic finally started to make babies. And they will continue to make babies for another 10, 12 years. And most of those millennials that don't have families yet, they live in the inner suburbs of our big cities. As they add their 1.5 kids to the household, the hipster apartment becomes cramped quite quickly, and they do need the larger dwelling. So what do? Well, they move to where those dwellings are available. They're not available in the inner city. We don't build large dwellings there. They can't move to suburbia where their baby boomer parents moved to when they did the same thing 4 decades ago, because their baby boomer parents are hogging the 3 and 4 bedroom stock. They were great NIMBYs, they block development. So millennials have to move to the urban fringe. And they'll continue for the next decade. So we'll see the millennials seeking out family-sized homes on the urban fringe, which means we put them far away from the main centers of employment. That means millennials will fight tooth and nail to work from home rather than go to the office. So that development will also be in the background. That's one of the big developments. It's millennials leaving the inner city, moving to the urban fringe. The other story is migrants. When migrants come to Australia, they don't know anything about the city they're moving into. Usually they know one address. And the address is either their university or it's their place of work. And so they move as close as possible to this single address. And then they hang out at that suburb, in that region for a little bit, a couple of years, during which they talk to their fellow students, co-workers. They hang out on realestate.com.au, and eventually they learn how the city works, and they then act like anyone else in the city, meaning they segregate based on their income, on their wealth. And the last big story is baby boomers, because baby boomers over the next 5-6 years are all moving into retirement age. Doesn't mean that they're all retired. Lots of baby boomers have knowledge jobs. They can work for a bit longer. But the general narrative, the too simplistic narrative is that, the kids are out of the house, you stop your career, you downsize. And turns out that baby boomers do not actually downsize at scale. Baby boomers, in fact, tell you stuff like, I want to be carried out of the family home. That is and remains the ultimate Australian dream. You could call it downsizing into the box, the little box, but ultimately that's not happening. Not yet, because baby boomers will downsize once their life circumstances change, once their health declines, which is still another decade away. And then pretty much soon after this, they start dying. And this is when things get really, really interesting in the Australian property market, because once they start dying in the I'm just thinking about how to best set up this narrative here, because what we are now talking about is the wealth transfer.
Exactly. I think because in 5 you've said the wealth shift is where
the wealth shift starts then, or it starts in the early 2030s, ends in the late 2040s. And so when we talk about wealth transfer, this can be anything. It just means that you hand wealth from the old generation to the young generation. That's all that is. And you can do this in several ways. You can maybe be the bank of mom and dad, and you can give your kids a couple of thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands of dollars for their own mortgage. That is a great way of transferring wealth, because it's super tax well, it's not tax efficient, it's financially efficient, because if you think about a mortgage that is 5.3% mortgage that you run over 30 years, which isn't too far off from what we have now, that means that you pay twice as much money to the bank as your mortgage is worth. So a $500,000 mortgage at 5.3% over 3 decades means you pay $1 million to the bank. That means, though, if you think as a family unit and you are the old parents and you give $100,000 to your kid who spends it on not having a $500,000 mortgage, but a $400,000 mortgage, means they only need to repay $800,000 to the bank. So for $100,000, you get twice the magic. It's a way of doubling your money. It is actually quite insane. So if you are able, as a big family unit, to act as the bank of mom and dad, it is a no-brainer for you to do so. Yeah, that has quite a few social implications about, you make the gap between the rich and the poor, the asset-rich and the asset-poor families widens and widens. But if you advise individual families, you'd go, do it. Yeah, to whatever degree you can, do it. It is helpful. So that's one way of transferring wealth, or paying for your grandkids' childcare. But mostly, these are awkward conversations to have, because you need to talk to mom and dad about their own mortality, and this is you just see this is a minefield. And most Australians don't do it. So most Australians transfer wealth from the old generation to the young generation only when the last parent dies. And that's mom. Yeah. Because mom is 4 years younger than dad. She has, on top of this, 4 years longer life expectancy. And this is where the timing of the wealth transfer comes in, because all I need to do in my demographic data sets is I need to count the number of baby boomer women. And I see year after year how this declines. We could call them instances of baby boomer women deaths. That's so morbid, isn't it? So we just talk about wealth transfer. It's so much cleaner.
It's a nicer word.
It's much more easy to communicate this as at a family dinner. And so we see that these numbers, they sit at around 80,000 this year, 80,000 instances of intergenerational wealth transfer. And they will tick up year after year until they reach a crescendo in 2041. That is peak wealth transfer. It'll stay elevated throughout the 2040s. And after this, it declines sharply, because then it is time for the Gen Xer women to die. And Gen X, so generation born in the 60s and 70s, that is a much younger, much smaller generation. So you won't have as much wealth being transferred. But that said, that means that the 2030s and 2040s are an incredible decade in the property market, because what will happen? What is the wealth that is being transferred? Well, it is the family home. The vast majority of the wealth sits there in the shape of a family-sized home in a inner to middle suburb of our big cities. These properties are worth a bucket load of money. The kids, of course, will first mourn the loss of mom for a week, and then they will sell the property. They will either sell it to a cashed-up family that needs to be cashed up to buy this expensive property, and that already densifies the area, because you carry mom out of the house and you put a family of 4 in. You quadruple the number of people in this plot of land. But more often than not, the baby boomer family home will be bulldozed, and we will put 2, 3, 28 townhouses on top of whatever we can squeeze in. And all of a sudden, we really densify an area there. So we take the land that was occupied by one person up to 10, 11 people, maybe even, in some instances. And that means, well, you see how much money is flowing into the property market. There's so much more movement, because as we take all of those baby boomers finally out of the inner and middle suburbs, who's moving in? It's not the young people of tomorrow, the young families, because they can't afford these relatively expensive properties. It is the millennials of today that we just pushed out to the urban fringe. They at that time are right around, they'll probably see the oldest kid leave the household first, so they can go back to the to the more attractive suburbs of our cities. what this means statistically is that we shorten the length of stay of a family in a house. So there's much more movement in the property market. So all of a sudden, if you're a real estate agent, if you are a mortgage broker, you hear this and you go, ha, this is great news for me. If you're an auctioneer, these things are great because there's more movement in the property market. And then what will the 2.5 kids of the baby boomer woman that died, what will they do with the newfound wealth? They will all throw it in the property market. They will either use it to pay off their own mortgage, or they will do what Australians always do when they have a bit of extra cash, and that's buy an investment property.
Yeah.
So the 20s, 30s and 40s, Nathan, you are not allowed to retire before 2050 because the 20s, 30s and 40s are going to be the wildest, most hectic decade on the Australian property market ever. So there is so much movement there that anyone who's playing the game sees more opportunities than in the past to snatch up a property simply because there's more movement.
I'm just excited as it is, Simon. Imagine how it's going to be.
You won't catch any sleep for 2 decades.
I always ask, like, my mum's like in her mid-80s now, and she always talks to me about areas that are like well expensive areas today, and she always refers to them as like rat-infested hellholes from back when she was younger, because when she was a kid, I always think, like, she goes, oh, this house used to sell for £1,200 or whatever, and it's like, wow, right? So it's like interesting to see what her, like, she always said to me, Balmain in Sydney is a rat-infested hole, right? Because as a kid on the North Shore, she was like, that's a cheap area, it's a nasty area, it's a work area. Now it's like a very bougie and expensive area. So it's interesting to see.
And it's a nice way. So you say mid-80s. So you have a conscious memory of 70 years, easily. 70, 75 years. And if you look back that long historically, you go, there's heaps of change. And of course, I'm 41, so I only have like 30 years of conscious memory to look back. But these kind of things, the older you get, the more intense these time frames become. And ideally, the lesson that you learn is that cities aren't stagnant places. And sometimes we forget this when we look at our own view of the world. We go, right now here, the neighbor to my right they bulldozed the house, so we got a construction site there. And that's, so be it. That makes sense. It's nothing to complain about because cities are not stagnant. Cities are moving around. And if you had a time lapse, which you can do with Google Maps, of the last 30, 40 years, you see that areas are changing. You must acknowledge this. And so in general terms, I'm a YIMBY. I want, in my decade, I want cities to change, to densify. And the stagnation is the death of a town. A stagnant town dies sooner or later.
And I guess the reality of it is when you look at a child that's like born and then it grows and grows and grows, right? The world was here before we were here. Yes. And when you got new life coming into the world, it's like the world, it never stays the same. It was here before we were here. It'll be here after we're here. Our time is short, and it's just the opportunities that you can see to capitalize while we're here and understanding that happened before, what's going to happen now based on the data.
Absolutely. That's, of course, where we try to look into the future with the demographic figures. Because, for example, once you forecast population movements, for people over 40. We only take in migrants under the age of 40. So if I look in what's happening to the older population, we know there isn't even what's going to happen with migration, because that's a bit of an unknown. These things could go up and down a bit. But the older people are super, super predictable. What is going to happen to the 40 plus cohort in Australia over the next 20 years, 30, 40 years will be spot on. We know what's going to happen. And I find that quite fascinating, that you have those fixed points that you can use to think about the future. There are, of course, unknowns. Did I have a pandemic on the cards in January 2020? No, I didn't. But the population movements overall were very, very logical. The day after the borders closed, I wrote a column about the future behavior of population flows within Australia, how you move to regions, how you use working from home and so forth. And that was easy to predict. And because we are not that complicated as humans. And yes, we do make lots and lots of emotional decisions, but overall households are reasonably pragmatic in their behavior. For example, when it becomes time to a couple has a child. Spoiler alert, the wife will be pregnant. The wife will be taking care of the initial first couple of months of child rearing. That's biology at play. But then when it comes time to send partners back to the workforce, households act logically, pragmatically, because they will send back. Life is expensive. They send back both partners, but they send back the lower earning partner at a lower rate than the higher income earning partner, if that makes sense. And so we now have more and more couples, not the majority, but more and more couples each year where she out earns him. And so we are seeing more primary care responsibilities sticking with more men. Not the majority, absolutely not. But overall, these trends are just logical. And we can look in the data and see where this is occurring by how much.
I was having a chat with a mate the other day because we're walking around the gym, like we go to the gym and walking around into the train station near it. Lots of workers come out of the train, right? It's like every 10 minutes there's like a sea of people walking past. And we're talking about migration. And one thing that stuck out to me the other day, and you touched on it beforehand, Simon, is the population, that the migrants that are moving in, like 50% of them are student. So if you're bringing in, if you got a child from like say 5 to 20, that kid needs expenses from the state to pay for it, right? Like it needs healthcare, needs all that sort of stuff. If you have an older person, they're going to need healthcare. They're not going to be able to provide enough to the country. But I noticed that 50% of, like you were saying beforehand, a large amount of the migrant population is students, because then you're getting them at the best point. They've got to spend the money to be a student here in the country, and they're going to be a good taxpayer to the country as well.
It is ludicrous. So this is the purely economic perspective. We're not taking any kind of social issues into consideration for now. You live a life, and a life is expensive, as you mentioned, in two parts. It is expensive while you grow up before you become a taxpayer. You get born. That's actually very expensive. You break arms, hopefully your own, and you get educated at school, at kindergarten, at school. University is subsidized if you are a local student. Big chunk of money. Then you finally become a taxpayer. You work for 40 plus years. You retire. You become expensive the older you get because you consume more medical things. And with migrants, we find some other sucker of a country, in my case, Germany, that paid for the first 20-something years of my upbringing. And you only get them the minute they are becoming taxpayers. And if they're international students, it's even better, at least in theory, because they actually pay for their own education with an arm and a leg. And they, again, theoretically are automatically educated to your standard. You integrate them into society for 4 years throughout university, and you then get them as a tax-paying permanent resident afterwards, which is insane. So, and if you're lucky, they get homesick at 75 and bugger off, but they don't, to be honest. You just then become sentimental about your hometown of Anatolia, your Greek island, your Bavarian Alps, for whatever it is, but ultimately you stay. But you still got the first 20 years for free. And there's a thing called the Intergenerational Report that gets published every 2 years, I think, and that looks ahead. It looks 40 years into the future of Australia, big demographic report, to ensure that politicians take long-term, strategies into consideration when they write their policies. And they have a beautiful chart in there that says, economically speaking, purely economically speaking, a Australian-born person is a net economic drain on the country, while a foreign-born person in Australia is a net economic gain. Which is, of course, something that I, the foreign-born dad, remind my Australian-born children of every night when I kiss them good night, is that they are the drag on the economy and I am the marvelous gift to the Australian society.
But the day is more like you doubled it because you're the gift, but then also you brought new people to the system as well by having this.
I do my bit for the ABS to have someone to count.
Yeah. Cool. And I guess just before we wrap up on the baby boomers as well, Simon, like what do you see some of like the risk and opportunities like as people are moving? And if you're an investor today, how could you benefit of, is there any areas that you think you could benefit from this shift?
Yeah, so there is a certain kind of, there's a life cycle in property. And traditionally you live with mom and dad, and then once you move out, you become a renter. Because you can't afford a house, you rent. Usually once you partner up, you start to wanting to buy a house, you save up for a couple of years, you buy a house, first home purchase. If you play your cards right, you can upgrade your house, then you can downgrade your house, then you might move into a retirement village, and then you might move into an aged care home, and then you die. So that's roughly the life cycle. There are ups and downs if you get divorced and so forth. But overall, we can associate these life cycles broadly with an age structure. And we do see that we see an increase in renters in the next 10 years. So any rental product is going to be of high demand. Also because of housing affordability has got awful, you have people renting for longer. So the rental window in the life cycle stretches out and out and out. So there are more people that need, these type of houses. Then for the next 10 years, the upgrader market, these are the families that, paid off most of their initial mortgage, and they want a bigger house so that these stinky teenagers are a bit further away, or not as loud, thicker walls. That market is not going to be growing all that much in the next 10 years because it's occupied by Gen X, which is a small generation. And of course, Gen X finds itself financially squeezed in the coming decades because they have financially dependent kids, and their parents are soon going to be of the age where they might need care of sorts. And this could either be indirect financial aid or just time that you spend on your parents. So Gen X will have a very, very tough decade in the next 10 years. And then pretty much on the same day, they will have their kids move out of the house and their parents die. And so all of a sudden they have much, much fewer financial responsibilities, and they get a bit of an inheritance. And so in 10 years' time, Gen X's life will be easy peasy. In the meantime, they struggle a bit, for example. And if we continue throughout the life cycle, the two sectors that will see by far the most growth in relative terms, it's actually ludicrous, is retirement living. These are the retirement villages. You don't have all that much healthcare in there, usually occupied by people 75 to 84 years of age. It's a very narrow window. And then, of course, aged care. We are going to double the Australian aged care system in the next 15 years, or we need to double it in the next 15 years. We will fail to do so. We will have nowhere near enough property, nowhere near enough aged care workers in the system to look after our old people. It's absolutely out of the question. So that, of course, means that, great financial advice here, don't end up in the bottom quarter of the income spectrum, because there will be no one taking care of you other than your family members.
So as you're saying that, I'm thinking I always think it's important to have generational wealth, right? Like I always say today, I'm not working for myself, I'm working for my kids, my grandkids, my great grandkids. And you mentioned that just a moment ago, that there's a poor generation that's occurring right now, but they'll become wealthy in the future. But if your parents aren't wealthy or are able to pass it on, a lot of renters and stuff that are in the old age, and the person dies with no money, that's going to disadvantage the child as well. And
quite significantly. And so we see this always happen. There were always haves and have-nots, but now the gap is bigger, and we essentially continued to erode the middle class. So back in the 60s, Australian society resembled a bell curve, with a couple of rich folks, couple of poor folks, but mostly we are this middle class country where most people sit in the middle. By now, Australian society much more resembles the letter U. More like a letter J, actually, where you have heaps of relatively wealthy people, relatively few poor people, but still a sizable number of poor people, and we essentially got rid of the middle class. So that means the poor people, they can't hand over wealth to their kids
Yeah.
So you have a quarter of society. It's reasonably big, so we can't talk about a rich minority here, but they'll have it fine. They'll be just okay. But what happens to the bottom third of society is very, very rough. And there is, of course, a risk that those people feel extremely disenfranchised and that they might then be increasingly drawn to political fringe ideas. That's a possibility. Not so much in Australia because we have we force you to vote. There's a preferential voting system, which is all things that soften the impact of the extreme parties. So it's not as extreme as it could be in, say, the European systems around the place.
Yeah. Today that is. That is.
That is for now. For now.
For now, yeah. But I think it's important. Like people ask me, like, is it too young to get started? I did a speaking event the other night, and one of my investors, I'll have him on a podcast shortly, just for those that are watching this. But one of my investors who just retired in the early 50s, but the child is like 19. There's two children. One's like 15, one's 19. The 19's got like 5 properties, right? And the reason being is that the conversations around the dinner table were like, oh yeah, get a job, start earning and save up a deposit, and have that deposit. And I never think it's too late or too early to get started, but like no one's going to have a more vested interest in their well-being than yourself. And, you can wait for mum and dad to die, but if the inheritance doesn't flow the way you think it will, then what's your plan B?
And of course, there's the general problem with wealth in old age that you don't know when you die. So there's lots and lots of arguments to be said that you should actually liquidate quite a bit of your wealth in old age. You pass it down to the next generation while you're still alive, because ultimately you're better serviced with wealth if you get it young. And so you can either give $100,000 maybe to your kids when they're in their 30s and they want to set up the family home. But when you die, your kids will be in their late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
You don't need money then. What for do you need money? You just got rid of your kids. You paid down most of the mortgage. You'll be fine, probably. But the order of difference, it would be much more comfortable to get money early, but the old people don't want to hand down money early because they don't know how long they're going to live, and they are, rightfully to a degree, afraid that they run out of money, and they don't want that. And so we're stuck there, and then they're now joking. It's a bit of a baby boomer trope meme that they say we're spending the kids' inheritance, and it's like, yes and no. It's not the inheritance because they haven't inherited it. So you do you happily spend.
You worked hard for it. So yeah, like the person, the parent, the boomer or whoever would work hard for. Yeah.
And it's a generational idea that boomers had. So for the baby boomer generation, always said they lived to work. They were brought up by parents who had it very tough. So the parents of the baby boomers saw the First World War, saw the Second World War. They had a Great Depression in the middle. So it's no surprise that the boomers understood the importance of money. And they said, we are going to forego family time in order to increase family income. And they always knew we work our butts off until we're in our mid to late 60s. And then we're going to enjoy our retirement. And they are now the perfect customer if you are in retail or something, or if you market holidays. Baby boomers are the best customer that you could dream up in a lab. They are still, for now, healthy enough to travel, to spend money. Yes, the joints hurt, but ultimately they're fine, medically speaking. They have time because they don't work, and they now they have money, and they now feel the urgency to part with the money because during the pandemic they particularly felt cheated out of 2 of their golden years, where they wanted to just spend big, travel, see the world. So it's that dream customer. So anyone who can deal with baby boomers in their in their business, well done. They're the best customers.
Yeah. Interesting. And transfer of the wealth from like one generation to the other. I always look at like the aristocrats and, the wealthiest that are out there, and the family sort of wealth that gets transferred and how they transfer that on. And a couple of things you said today, Simon, have made me think about that. Like, a lot of people are just like, oh, you get it when I die or whatnot. But the way that you were talking beforehand, and I think about it, like if someone's 60 today and they'll be 80 in 20 years' time, if they've got a kid that's 30 or 40 today and they're trying to get started, if they lend them 200 grand of equity today, it'd be much better than giving them 500 grand worth of inheritance when they die, because
it sounds weird. It sounds weird to people. And it's also, there's a broader argument. The single most common cause for siblings to hate each other and not talk to each other is fighting over an inheritance.
Yeah.
And you can avoid this by handing out the inheritance while you are alive.
And you watch it play out. There's a parent, you can watch it play out in front of you, how, there's nothing.
It's brutal. And it's also understandable. If you just were to actually take just a pile of belongings of your parents and you spread it out on the front yard, and you and your siblings, you all get a piece of paper and you have to write down how much this pile of stuff is worth. You will come up with vastly different numbers.
Yeah.
And we don't care how much it is worth. We care how much you think it is worth. And so people feel shortchanged, and this will never be forgotten, because it's such an important life event when your parents die that you remember this. And as parents, I think the best you can do is downsize your house. It's too much, and do it while you're in your 70s. So that you can still reestablish a healthy life. Also, your mental health goes down once your partner dies, but your mental health absolutely plummets if your partner dies and you find yourself in a large home in a car-dependent area. That's worst for mental health. So don't do that. So downsize, hand out the belongings to the kids, sell it, give it away, whatever it is, and hand out wealth as much as you can. Be conservative because you want to live forever. But do this while you're alive. It is the best thing, because you not only guarantee that you can see the joy that your money brings to your kids right now, you also make it much more likely that your kids do not hate each other once you die.
Yeah. If you're not around, you can't even chair the fight. If you've got 3 kids or 4 kids that are fighting. Yeah.
That's it. And then you could at least, you could actually argue about something like, well, of course, we give him a bit more because she went to university for 3 more years or something, whatever it is.
This one helped me out more, or someone,
exactly. And ultimately, it is the parents' wealth, and it is the parents' wealth to hand it out. Whereas then the kids fight for it. And once you have this dynamic, naturally you want more, and that's a terrible dynamic to treat to have in a family. So whatever you can do there, do it now. And it's a particularly egotistic move from old people to die with a bucket load of stuff. I would actually by now go as far as saying it is your responsibility to die with as little crap as possible, because ultimately your crap is going to lead to either tons of work for other people, or it might even lead to fights, family fights. So downsize your belongings, minimize your belongings. This is actually your responsibility. Your stuff is not a treasure to be held within the family forever. Some heirlooms, of course, are, but most of your stuff just needs to go while you're still alive.
Yeah.
I sounded more aggressive than I wanted here, but yeah.
That's all right. That's all right. The emotion of like, oh no, this thing was worth $10,000, and it's like, no, there's a pot that's $20, but on the market it's $20, but to you, your mum used to cook your stew in it, and now that stew's has the memory. So.
Exactly. And it's impossible to value those things. And ultimately you don't need it. And you do need rather 1 or 2 treasured items to remember a loved one, rather than 2 or 3 garages full of crap.
Yeah. Got it. And we've covered off on a lot today, Simon. I really appreciate your time. Is there anything that you're seeing, anything else that you're seeing out there, like apart from, boomer generations. It's really good content that we've discussed today on that front. So thanks for sharing that. Is there any other migrant-based stuff or millennial stuff or Gen Z stuff that are,
So we are recording this a couple of days before the election.
Okay.
So I think I must quickly mention the demographics of politics because we talk an awful lot about housing affordability in this country. And we say housing needs to be more affordable, and people say we need to build more housing. It's perfectly true. And people say, well, we need to make housing more affordable, so we need to let in fewer migrants. You always want to remember what housing affordability means. It is the relationship between the money, the income that you have, and the price of the house. That is housing affordability. So to make housing more affordable, you essentially can do two things. You can give people more money, or you can make the value of the house go down, or make the value of the house stagnant and slowly give people more money. You can move those two things around. That's what housing affordability is. It is absolutely nothing else. The dollar value of a house is pointless. And so you then want to think about how will the housing market change over time? And I would say, politically speaking, bugger all will happen. Because ultimately, both major parties will want house prices to go up. They want housing less affordable rather than more affordable, regardless of what they're saying. Why do I say this? So if you only look at the voters, and remember, as a politician, a cynical, self-serving politician, not that they exist, you would only be caring about voters. And only 64% of the people in Australia vote. A big chunk is under 18, and a big chunk are permanent residents, temporary residents. They are not citizens. They don't vote. So 64% of people vote. Out of these 64%, only 26% are renters. 40% are mortgage holders, and the remainder already own their house. So saying I want to make housing more affordable is welcome by 26% and hated by 74% of the population. So that's stupid. So you will not introduce any policy that makes housing ultimately more affordable. You won't.
Plus it'd be less in tax and stamp duty and revenue and land tax and all that.
Exactly. It's quite a bizarre thing. And so as a cynical politician, you'd come, well, the best policy I could come up with is a policy that looks like it makes housing more affordable, so that the 26% are happy, while actually doing the exact opposite, driving up house prices. And turns out we mastered it. First home buyer grants. What an absolute load of crap. You give tens of thousands of dollars to a young person and say, here, spend it on this asset, the house. But please don't tell the market about it, because the market immediately factors this in and drives up prices. So you use public money to drive up house prices. That is dumb. The only thing dumber is what the Liberals propose. And this is, you use your superannuation to buy a house. So you waste your own money to drive up the price of the asset that you buy. From a housing affordability perspective, that is criminal. It makes housing less affordable rather than more. So in a sense, and we take the purely pragmatic, we don't care about the societal impacts of people, young people not having houses at this point. This is an investment podcast. There we go. Housing investment. You can rest assured that in the foreseeable future, under both Labour and Liberal governments, house prices will not fall. Not markedly, because all of the major policy levers that we could push to drive house prices down, which is needed to make housing more affordable, they will not occur.
Great, Simon. That's I think it's what people like to hear and they need to hear. And this last election, every election I've seen is like they talk about removing negative gearing and scrapping negative gearing. Everybody talks about that now. It's like, how can they fuel more liquidity in the market, which is ultimately people think, oh, I'm going to get $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000, but ultimately it's going to add more fuel because they're creating more liquidity and devaluing and cheapening the currency we have. Which I always say the property. If you have a 3-bedroom red brick house that was $500,000, went to $1 million, went to 1.5, the house didn't get any better. It's still 3-bedroom red brick. It's the value of the currency that's been eroded. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's it's a brutal thing. And ultimately for the economic system of Australia, the overmarket is probably overheated. It is not helping. If you were to, the same bread bricks that you purchase, whether they're worth $1 million or $500,000, the same stuff. But the money that you would have spent that you would not have spent on the house, you would have spent otherwise. Either you would have been a happy consumer and purchased like crap, or you would have thrown it at the stock market. And you finally would have then injected fuel into the productivity of our businesses because they have more money to invest in, which we are not doing. So Australia has been falling behind in all of those beautiful global rankings like the Global Innovation Index, the Global Economic Complexity Index. All of those indices, Australia has been falling down because our wealth is created through mining, and mining prices essentially just went up by dumb luck, so to speak, over the last couple of decades. And that was enough for us to do well enough to not actually consider any kind of deeper underlying reform. Do I see any major appetite of both major parties in the short term? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
In the long term, that's a different game because I would be forecasting that in about 18 years, neither Labour nor Liberal parties are politically relevant anymore. They will be gone and dead. And these parties are right now killing themselves off permanently. We're seeing this at the last federal election in 2022. 31.1% of first votes, primary votes, went to third parties. Everyone from Pauline Hanson to the Greens as one party, 31.1%. I'm very certain that on this Saturday, these numbers will be higher. I think we might crack a third. 33.3% is my target. And so we see bit by bit that the younger voters have very, very poor opinions about Labour and Liberal. They have no party loyalty. They have no party partisanship. So that means each election we take out by death, loyal Liberal and Labour voters, and we replace them with people who hate Labour and Liberal. In about 18 years' time, this will be enough for neither political party to be relevant, unless they majorly change their tune, and I think neither of them has the guts to do so.
Yeah. Very interesting, Simon. I appreciate the foresight, and let's see what happens after the election.
Exactly. If you listen to this podcast after the election, hopefully you can comment how right I was. Otherwise, let's not speak about this ever again.
Simon, you're very right on lots of things, and I think, especially after last time, everyone was going, "How can I find out more about Simon? What does he do? Does he have a subscription I can subscribe to? Does he have a column he writes in? Books to read? Where can people connect with you?"
First thing is to type this weird, annoying German name into LinkedIn, connect via LinkedIn. I have a column in the New Daily each week. I have a column in the Australian every month. I make money by speaking at events, at conferences, by consulting to businesses, to governments about how demographics are changing and what they do about it. So that's how I make my money. If you want to really support me, book me. But other than this, just follow on LinkedIn. That's where I share my columns, my work. And the idea there is quite educational. So I want to make sure that people occasionally read an article about the demographic worldview, and they then bit by bit add this to their way of looking at the world. And I think, self-serving narrative, that this will ultimately make you better investors, parents, bosses, whatever it is. Adding demography on top doesn't hurt.
Beautiful. Thanks, Simon. Appreciate that. And appreciate your time today. It's very, very generous of you to spend the time with us on the podcast. And I know there's a lot of our viewers.
Great delight.
Awesome. Thanks, Simon. Well, appreciate it. Until next time, be well. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. If you do like this video, do a thumbs up, share it with your friends and family, and make sure you go and follow Simon on his socials. And we'll catch up next week. Have a great day, everyone.
Like Bilal said, man, we stuck in the matrix. This my advice, don't care if you take it.